everybody's about made their way into class. Good to see all them kids there this morning and running around there. Always good. So we're going to start here this morning. I'm going to introduce the book of 1 Peter. It's my goal anyway. We'll go through the rest of the general epistles, and we'll kind of get into that and how Peter addresses this to the general public there. But as always, if you want me to go do a little something different, or if you have a question, I know some people have been asking about some other things, or at least asking questions, not so much a study, but we may turn around and do that maybe when we finish this, because it seems like sometimes there's some confusion in some of these things. So we might take a little time and discuss some of the premillennial stuff, the raptures and things, and millennial reigns and things like that. And we covered a lot of that when we were going kind of introducing into Revelation, but there is some confusion when it comes to the Antichrist and the 1,000-year reign and the rapture and things like that, and the signs, things. So we may end up going that way, because like I said, I do get some questions concerning those, but that'd be kind of the direction maybe after. But we got to get through 1st, 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Jude. So it'll be a little bit before we go there, and I may change my mind, but if I don't, that's where we'll go. 1 Peter. All right, again, I know I made the comment, but it is a great study when we go through this, because it helps us today. If you're, again, we talked about it in class, when we think about our struggles and persecution in the lightest form as Christians today, it's nothing to be compared with what those Christians in the first century were going through, but it still helps us nonetheless. I made the comment Wednesday night when we were going through introducing the book of Judges. If you have a Bible that has some gaps up here towards the front, like a little introduction, I always kind of like writing some of that stuff in there. It might be that one day maybe you are even teaching class and you want to go back, or maybe you're having a personal study. 1 Peter, and sometimes those little, it's not really a cheat sheet, but kind of those quick notes when you get there do help you, again, especially when you look at the context and what's going on and why Peter's writing these things. So when we begin here looking at, again, the author is identified as the Apostle Peter, and we see that there in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 1. Thankfully, Peter addressed himself in this, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the strangers scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. So he goes ahead and addresses himself. He does call himself an apostle as well. That was the argument for James of why James wasn't the Apostle James, because he just says James, a servant of God, or the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes scattered abroad, greetings. But what he says in that is he doesn't put himself as an apostle. But usually Paul will address himself as an apostle. Peter addresses himself as an apostle. So that kind of helps limit all that especially. All right, so 1 Peter 1:1, Peter is the author. Now, he's a fisherman. And again, I know we were kind of talking about it in class this morning. I always liked reading the gospel accounts, because these were just 12 ordinary men, right? They were fishermen. Some of them were fishermen, some of them were the occupations, but they weren't the scribes and the scholars. Now, Paul was educated. When you look at Paul, he was a Pharisee, so he was very educated in the Mosaic law, and God used Paul, and I love, he's a great character in the Bible. But when you look at that, the apostles were just simple men. They were easygoing men, and I always kind of like that, liking to fish myself, that God thought enough of these men, and they were just fishermen. So it gives me hope with all that. Looking at Mr. Harold back here, he's a fisherman as well. So it gives me good hope with all that as well. But he's a fisherman. We see that in Matthew chapter 4, looking in verse 18. And Jesus, walking by the Sea of Galilee, saw two brethren, notice Simon, called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishers. So we see Peter and Andrew. That's a good lesson in that. When you look at Andrew, when we think about not having a big name and doing these things, when you look at Andrew, he's Simon Peter's brother, right? That's always, when you hear Andrew, oftentimes he's Simon Peter's brother. He's not far without the other. And that's okay. Andrew was a good guy too. But he and his brother Andrew, they're fishermen. His home is going to be in Capernaum. And I'll show you a map here in just a moment where that's at. But again, when you look in Matthew chapter 4, looking in verse 12, or Jesus met him in Capernaum at that location. It's where he's going to see him when he's doing his ministry through that. Matthew chapter 4, looking, verse 13, and now leaving Nazareth, he came and dwelt in Capernaum, which is upon the sea coast in the borders of Zebulun and Nephthalim. Now, those who are here on Wednesday nights that have looking at the Israelite tribal allotment, those two names down there, Zebulun and Nephthalim, should be familiar with you in that sense, that border kind of getting around that area and where he's going to be located. But Peter's home's in Capernaum. He's right there by the Sea of Galilee. All right, well, I've got the slide next. I should pull that up. All right, Capernaum is kind of right up here towards the north end of that. Notice Nazareth is down here. Cana, that's where Christ in John chapter 2, Christ would perform his first miracle in Cana. And he goes out into Galilee, and he goes into these areas down through here. And again, Capernaum is kind of going to be his home, and he's going to be doing a lot. But when we talk about his ministry, being in the sea, being in the boat, the fishes, all that stuff is because not so much Nazareth way over here, but all around the Sea of Galilee is where he's going to be doing his ministry in that area. All right, I don't know why I've got that one. I guess, all right, that's what I'm looking for. Peter and Andrew, they were partners with James and John. So when you go to Luke chapter 5, that last slide was the same thing I'd been saying. I guess I'm bad to duplicate them and kind of rework them. So I guess I had an extra one in there. Apologize for that. Luke chapter 5, looking there in verse 10. And so was also James and John, the sons of Zebedee, which were partners with Simon. And Jesus said unto Simon, Fear not, from henceforth thou shalt catch men. So when Jesus is talking to them, so pretty interesting that when Christ calls these men, we find Peter and Andrew, and then James and John. And that's typically how they're kind of linked together. But they were all fishermen. These were the fishermen. They were working. They were partners. And it's kind of fascinating that Jesus calls these men, and they were willing to, again, partners and everything, working their livelihood to just pack up everything and leave and go with Jesus. So these fishermen, kind of neat. So Simon, Peter, you'll hear him kind of Simon, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Now, here's something also worth considering, that Peter was a married man. Now, again, we got a little time, but when we talk about Peter and the Pope and being the first Pope and things like that, I talked to a friend of mine who was a Catholic. I did ask him about this. I said, why is Peter a Pope when the Pope can't be married? And he said, well, he was already married before he got to be the Pope, so they kind of let him go at that, but everybody else after that couldn't be married. So not too good of an argument to stand upon. But we do need to note that he was married. Again, Matthew chapter 8, looking there in verses 14 and 15. And when Jesus was come into Peter's house, he saw his wife's mother laid and sick of a fever. There in Matthew chapter 8 and verse 14. So he was a married man. That's important as well as we continue in this. All right, notice he was married. He was a fisherman, but he was also an elder in the Lord's church. So if we go to 1 Peter chapter 5, looking in this context of what's going on here, 1 Peter chapter 5, looking there, word 1 through 3, he says, The elders which are among you I exhort, who am also an elder. All right, so Peter was an elder. So that means then that he was, again, he has to be a husband of one wife, so we see that he is married, but he must also have believing children as well. So Peter, being qualified to be an elder in that, you can go to Titus chapter 1, 5 through 6 if you want to see the qualifications. Again, must be blameless, the husband of one wife, having faithful children, not accused of riot or unruly. So Peter fit this description. He was an elder in the church. Interestingly, too, with his wife, Peter was accompanied by his wife on at least some of his travels. I don't have this up here, but 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 5, when Paul is addressing some of the liberty that they have as apostles and those kind of things, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, looking there in verse 5, he says, Have we not power to lead about a sister, a wife, as well as other apostles, and as the brethren of the Lord, and Cephas? So Cephas, being there. That's what Paul called Peter. So he says, look, Peter's carrying his wife on his missionary work and doing these things. He's like, do I not have liberty to do this as well? If I was married, I could do that. We understand the argument sometimes Paul gives for being married or not married, that he said it's not wrong, but you can maybe do more work if you were not married. So he says, can I not lead about a wife? So interesting that Peter would do this missionary work and his wife would be along with him. So I found that intriguing as I was going through the study in preparation for this. The last mention of Peter is in the historical books anyway, is in Acts chapter 15. It's where we find the last time that we are referred to, or that the Luke writing Acts, the historian there, he references Peter. Again, noticing he is referred to as well in Galatians chapter 2. Peter is referred to in Galatians chapter 2. We were there in Galatians 6, and that's in Galatians 2 is when Paul confronts Peter to his face because he was eating with the Gentiles, and the Jews came in, and Peter got up and went to go sit with the Jews and left the Gentiles, and Paul says, I confronted him right to his face. And kind of like what he was talking to us there this morning in the passage of that scripture. Again, not as arrogant, but talking to him, telling him that he was leading people astray in that. So Paul even able to do that with him in that sense. So pretty interesting. In Galatians 2, Peter's mentioned. But that's really the last time we hear him. Then in the context of the Bible, or in the chronological order of the books being placed in there, we find the books that bear his name, 1st and 2nd Peter. Obviously, there that we'll find him as well. And now tradition, which again, I don't try to hold a candle too hard to the idea of tradition, but sometimes they can carry some weight. But we have to be reminded that it's not inspiration, but it is tradition. They hold that he was crucified upside down. That he was not willing to be crucified like the Lord, upright like that. Again, last week we were here to talk about that. If you missed that, I encourage you to go to YouTube or Facebook, and I've got a lesson on the crucifixion, what was going on in that. So Peter, again, one of the apostles, he was willing. We talked about this in class, I think it was last Sunday, that when we're talking about the resurrection of Jesus Christ and how valid the resurrection is, and we say, well, how do we know that Christ really rose from the dead, is because the apostles all died very horrible deaths. And because Peter was willing to be crucified upside down. You remember the account, Peter, that he was denying Christ, right? Before Christ was arrested, or when he was arrested, he's denying him 3 times. He's swearing an oath, and he's saying, look, I don't know who this man is. I have nothing to do with this man. You've never seen me before. After the resurrection, Peter is willing to die, right? He's willing to be crucified upside down because he knows that Christ rose from the dead. So that's compelling to us, and I think we were talking about that, Tyler Moss and I, talking about that in class, that it's almost like that it's bad for the apostles, but it's almost like that helps us to understand that they were willing to suffer unimaginable deaths because they said, look, that's what we were talking about. We said we'd be willing, if it was a lie, right, if it was just a scam, we'd be ready to cough it up and say, all right, look, it was all made up, it was all a lie, just put me to death, but don't crucify me. But not only Peter, but the other apostles, right? Some of them being sawn in half and beheaded and things like that. We were talking about John, who wrote the Revelation. He was boiled in oil, and then he was banished to Patmos. So these men were going through horrific types of deaths, but they were willing to say, I'm not going to give up because I know Christ was resurrected. So it's very compelling, these men who saw Christ before, the way they acted before, and the way they act after the resurrection to show the proof that he was resurrected. So very good. But anyway, Peter, I've got it right there. I thought I had a slide. Right? That's, again, obviously, that's a rendition. Peter being crucified upside down because he did not want to be compared with Christ, which is, again, tradition. That's the traditional argument is Peter didn't want to be compared with Christ, but it's interesting that some religious organizations place him up there in a higher position today. We'll leave that right there. So here's the dating on some of that. So again, they claim that he went to Rome, that Paul went to Rome, or Peter. You have to say that Peter went to Rome because you have to say that Peter established the church at Rome because he's got to be the first pope. So that's why they really try to push Peter being in Rome. And the reason they push Peter as the first pope is because Jesus said, I'll give you the keys of the kingdom in Matthew 16. So if Peter's got the keys of the kingdom and he can bind on earth and loose on earth, then the pope is Peter and he's got the power to bind on earth and loose on earth. You might be reminded of that in our church history lessons. Seems like a long time ago now, but we were going through that. But Peter has to be there. He has to be in Rome. He has to be there. But again, nowhere do we find the claim that he was. We know Paul was in Rome, but Paul didn't get handed the keys of the kingdom. So Peter's got to be the man. Again, the reports of his death being around 67 A.D., being about 75 years old. That's tradition. So him dying about 67 A.D. But it was interesting when we go to John chapter 21, or it's intriguing to me. John chapter 21, if you notice in verse 18, Christ is going to tell Peter kind of how he's going to die. In John 21 and 18, verily, verily, I say unto you, when thou wast young, thou girdedst thyself and walkest about, or walkest wherever thou wouldest. But when thou shalt be old, thou shalt stretch forth thine hand, and another shall gird thee and carry thee whither thou wouldest not. And he spake this, signifying by what death he should glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said unto him, follow me. So he says, look, you kind of went about where you're going. You're going to be imprisoned, and you're going to die for me. And he still followed him even at that. So pretty compelling. All right, so the purpose. That's why I've got the slide up here now. The purpose of the epistle, as is stated in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 12. That's the reason we're getting this letter here for Peter to the general churches there. By Silvanus, a faithful brother unto you, as I suppose I have written briefly, exhorting and testifying that this is the true grace of God wherein you stand. So Peter's purpose in this is to edify, right? To strengthen, to exhort these Christians who are going through heavy persecution. So that's what we're looking at, persecution from the outside here in 1 Peter. That he's going to be talking about. There's going to be a lot of people that are going to be, and we're going to get into that here in the time that we have left. There's going to be a lot of rulers in authority that are going to be persecuting the church tremendously. And he's going to say, look, you've got to stay faithful. So when we read there, and I'll make mention of this, in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15, growing up I always thought that I had to be ready to give any Bible answer you've got, right? Why did Nicodemus come to Jesus at night? I had to be ready to answer that. But when it says, but sanctify the Lord God in your hearts and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear, Peter's really saying is because we're going to look at that here in just a moment, when you stand before the magistrate and they say, why are you a Christian? You better be ready to answer. You better be ready to say, this is why I won't forsake Christ. So it's good to answer Bible questions, but don't be thinking when you read that I have to be ready to answer any question that comes up. It's not so much that. It's more, why are you a Christian? Right? Why are you here this morning? Why are you a Christian? Are you willing to die for Christ? That kind of stuff. And we're going to get to that in just a moment. In light of the information contained in the epistle, we can see that the message was intended to urge them to remain steadfast in the face of the persecution they were facing or that was impending. So again, either at the time, we're going to get into kind of some of the timing of this, either what they were going to be getting into or what they were currently going through. So he wants them to know that you're going to suffer. You're going to have to suffer, but have hope. So that's what we're looking to. He did write to Christians in general. This was not to a specific church. Again, so like when we were looking at Galatians there this morning, he was writing to the churches there in Galatia, or the church. I think I said churches this morning. I meant to look at that. Churches of Galatia, there in Galatians chapter 1, verse 2. But he's not writing to a specific congregation. He's just writing to Christians in general. Now, who's he writing to? When you go to 1 Peter 1, as we made the comment there at the beginning of the introduction, 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1, to the strangers scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. But these are the same individuals who we're going to see who are going to be at Pentecost. So when you go to Acts chapter 2, Let's look at this. Acts chapter 2, looking in verses 8 through 11. On the day of Pentecost, Peter is speaking here. I'm going to give the first gospel sermon of Acts chapter 2, verse 8. And how hear we every man in our own tongue wherein we were born, Parthians and Medes and Elamites and the dwellers of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Persia, Pamphylia, Egypt, and the parts of Libya about Cyrene, and strangers of Rome, Jews and proselytes, Cretes and Arabians. We do hear them speak in our own tongues with the wonderful works of God. So Paul's addressing these individuals who would have been present there on the day of Pentecost as well. And we're going to kind of, I think I've got, yeah, all right, perfect. All right, so when we're kind of looking at this, probably a little hard to see some of these. When I blow these slides up, they're not as good. Pontus is way up here, kind of really north of Palestine, going up to this is Pontus. Galatia, when he's writing to the churches there, Galatia. I don't know if it's on here or not. Galatia, right there, sorry. So we're going to see Galatia coming up here. Asia Minor is what that's called. Cappadocia, this area right here, just west or just east of that, Asia. Now again, when you think of Asia, like Turkey, that kind of like Asia Minor is what we're talking about in Asia. Bithynia, going up here to the top. So this whole section right in here is who Paul's addressing this letter to here in First. Now it's not just him, obviously. They can go on through there. But when you read in the account of Acts, notice that these Jews were coming all the way from, here's Macedonia, kind of coming up through here, and traveling down to Jerusalem here in Palestine. Would be down here in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, Jerusalem, to the day of Pentecost. So these were devout Jews going in. He's taking this message and addressing these individuals as well. All right? Here's the date of the letter. I think I said the date of the letter a while ago. Sorry about that. This is the date of the letter. We were talking about the death. I guess I was looking at the death of Peter, getting that confused. Now, the date of the epistle is estimated to be around 65 A.D. So if you want to write that up in your Bible, around 65 A.D. Now the reason behind this is Nero is going to burn Rome on July 19th, 64, A.D. 64. After Nero burned Rome, he needed a scapegoat. He needed somebody that he could blame this on, so he started to blame the Christians, right? That's what tradition holds, that he would blame the Christians in doing so. So it might be that this was written to kind of help the Christians as they were being persecuted by Nero, a very wicked man. You can go through in passages like 1 Peter chapter 1, 6 and 7, that he's talking about how they're going through manifold temptations and the trial of your faith. So again, this trial, right? You're being put to the test. Now, it's not like here today where maybe somebody laughs at us or makes a bad comment on Facebook, something like that. We're going to get into here just here in just a second what these people were going through. So again, he's saying you got to be standing firm in that. Again, 1 Peter 4, 17 through 19. You're going to be put to the test. You're going to be tried. You're going to have to face these persecutions. So anywhere between late AD 64 and early AD 65. So 64 to 65 AD is what you're going to be looking at here for the date of the writing of Peter, 1 Peter. Or that's what at least what I have read is what they kind of tend to put that toward. Okay, let's look at the persecution that was going to be arising. Now I know that's it's small, there's a lot up there, but this is important because it kind of helps paint the picture. If you want to do some more studying in this, you can look at John Fox's Book of Martyrs. He goes through this and he talks about these persecutions. So here, again, you have Christ being here on earth and being resurrected, and the church kind of has this time where they're growing and they're doing all this. And again, around 30 in the 30s AD. Now we are in about 67 AD. So about 30 years removed from this. How's the church? What's going on? But Nero is going to begin to persecute this. Now I've got it kind of bolded, and it's a little hard to see. But I know Tyler Moss and I were talking about this the other day. It says, in particular, this is talking about Nero. This is what he would do to Christians. In particular, he had some sewed up in skins of wild beasts and then worried by dogs until they were expired. And others dressed in skirts in shirts, made stiff with wax, fixed to axle trees, and set on fire in his gardens in order to illuminate them. So this is Nero. And again, some people look at the individual in Revelation as Nero, but I think he's going to fit this other description of Domitian here in just a moment. But anyway, this is what the Christians were having to face. Now, you just imagine, here in the 7-8 minutes we have left, we're here meeting this morning. What a great time it was, right? Beautiful weather outside. We were able to meet in this comfortable building, surrounded by our friends and family without any fear. What if soldiers came in this morning, grabbed us, and said, all right, are you Christian, right? We would have to be ready to say if we were or not. And if we said we were, this is what's going to happen to us. We're going to have to be either ran and chewed up by dogs. We're going to have to be set on fire there in the garden. So this is the persecution. And Peter and Paul are both killed during this time of Nero. So again, AD 67, I was talking about that earlier. So in the time of Nero, and I think Paul was killed by Nero. When you read there in Romans 12, I had it out there on the marquee. No, it's not Romans 12. When we're to pray for our rulers, no, it's Timothy. I'm trying to pull all this out from my memory. I'm sorry. But anyway, when Paul's writing there in the Scripture, and he's talking about how that we should pray for those who have rule over us, and we are to pray for those individuals. 1 Timothy chapter 2, exhort therefore that first ye all supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings, and for all that are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and honesty. Nero was the emperor, the king, the Kaiser, Caesar. He was the king. And Paul, writing that in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1, or verse 2 is for kings. That's who Paul's talking to. He says, pray for Nero. That's compelling to me when we think about the people who are in charge. But Paul being willing to say that. All right, so Nero's in charge. He's ruling. He's going against the Christians. Then we kind of see this persecution, and then there's kind of another one that's going to come up with Domitian. Again, this is going to be around AD 81 is when this is going to start. But they're really going to get, again, I think this is what's leading into the Revelation. But notice what is said, a law was made that no Christian, once brought before the tribunal, should be exempted from punishment without renouncing his religion. So when you read the Revelation, when Jesus is writing there, what? I say it all the time, Revelation 2:10, be faithful unto death, be faithful right up to the face of death, because they said you're going to be brought before these tribunals, and you're going to be asked if you're a Christian, and if you don't renounce your religion, you're going to be put to death. He said you have to be faithful right up into that point. Now notice, another hardship was that when any Christians were brought before the magistrates, a test oath was proposed. When, if they refused to take it, death was pronounced against them. And if they confessed themselves Christians, the sentence was the same. So the test oath would be, you bow and worship Domitian. He's your emperor, he's your God. Will you vow this oath to Domitian as your God? And as a Christian, you would say, no, Domitian's not my God. God is my God, right? Christ, he's my Savior, he's my Lord. Death. And that's really what we're trying to get at, what Peter's trying to get at when you go through this book, is that I'm not saying like you got to be ready to go down here to the gas station and somebody say something about a Christian and you say, yeah, I'm a Christian, I got it hard. No, he's saying they're going to put you to death. If you say you're a Christian, dead. You're dead. That's it. That's all there is to it. So that's kind of what we're looking at. And again, thankfully we don't face that persecution today. But that's it. When you get brought up, if you say you're a Christian, we're going to, and again, they didn't just behead you. They would crucify you. They would have you eaten by animals. Those kind of put you in the arena, the Colosseum. That's what they did. All right, now here's the third persecution under Trajan in AD 108. So notice what he says. I interrogated them as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second and a third time, threatening them with punishment. Those who persisted, I ordered executed. So again, that's what happened. They would come in and say, look, you're a Christian, right? You're meeting and you're a Christian. You're a follower of Jesus. Yes. Brought before the trial, again, I'm going to kill you. All right, I'm going to feed you to the lions. I'm going to crucify you. I'm going to burn you at the stake. Are you a Christian? Peter, 1 Peter 3:15, you be ready to give that answer. He says, you be ready to answer them and tell them about the hope that lies within you with meekness and fear, right? I can't turn my back on Jesus, right? He's never turned. That's what Polycarp, his famous saying is, they ask him to renounce. He's about to be burned at the stake. He says, he's never left me. Why would I leave him now? So if you're going to keep on, and if you're going to keep doing that, I'm going to kill you. And that's what they were. They were ordered to die. Now you would think that if that was happening, surely the church would be about done with, right? Who would be a part of the church? But the church was still growing, and in fact, it was growing better probably than it is today with the persecution. All right, now I've got one more one that I want to kind of talk about here with this. I think, let me see if I can find it. I thought I had it on the screen. I guess that's what it was. But when Pliny, I guess I was talking to the class. When Pliny the Younger, he's writing this letter to Trajan, the emperor, and he says, I don't know how to handle. He says, I've never before participated in trials of Christians. He says, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to handle them. They're seemingly good people. They just worship Christ, and they're doing these things. And he says they won't renounce that. But he makes an interesting point, if I can find it. I'm getting to that. I guess I don't have it highlighted. But he does say, he said, they asserted, however, a substance of their faith or error had been that they were accustomed to meet on the first day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ or to a God, and to bind themselves by oath not to do some crime, but not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, not falsifying their truth, nor to refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so. So what he's saying is that's the only thing they're guilty of is meeting and participating and being a Christian. And he says, I don't know how to handle them, but he does say, that's where it is. He says, others named by the informer. So again, someone would say, look, Ben Williams, his wife Brittany, they're Christians. He's the informer, declared that they were Christians, but then denied it, asserting that they had been but had ceased to be, some 3 years before, others many years, some as much as 25 years. They all worshipped your image and the statues of gold, and cursed Christ. So these individuals, they said, look, I was a Christian, but I've given all that up, right? Caesar's my God, and I've cursed Christ. Fascinating, but that's what these people were doing. But again, so when you hear Peter talking about this, you have to be faithful. You have to be willing to die. That's what we're talking about here in the context. So Trajan writes back to Pliny. He says, keep doing what you're doing. It seems to be the best situation with what's going on. But it's amazing. It's amazing what these individuals were going through, right? That they were willing to be burnt alive. They were willing to be sawn in half, eat by lions. I mean, you name it, right? Some very, very, again, that Fox's Book of Martyrs is very compelling in what was going on with those individuals, what they were having to face. Hebrews 11, when you read there in Hebrews 11, kind of talking about some of that stuff, what those individuals were going through, what they had to face, and all that stuff, it's amazing what they were doing. So when we're going through this study of 1 Peter, and Peter is encouraging us even today. He says, you've got to be faithful. You've got to be encouraged. You've got to be willing to do all this stuff. It should help us, because that's what the Christians in that day were facing. And we say, well, we're not facing anything quite like that. If they can do it, we can do it. And we must be willing to be dedicated and right up into the face of death, be willing to say that I'm a Christian. So, pretty good. Anybody got anything maybe on the introduction there for 1 Peter? All right. Well, very good. Maybe that was helpful to you, educational to you. But like I said, Lord willing, we'll start into 1 Peter there, and we'll kind of be picking that apart, looking at the topics that are taught in there. Look forward to that study. What a great time, right, to be here at Murray City. Wednesday nights, we've got the Old Testament. We're going through the book of Judges. I think the adult class, they're going through He Was Here, looking at the places that Christ was living while here on earth, and then going back to the Psalms. And then young adult, we're going through the survey of the Bible, Sharpening the Sword. We've got the general epistles. It's just a great time to be out here to be able to study. A lot of things being taught.